blue leather jacket.
Please rise and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, and welcome to the Attleboro School Committee meeting of Monday, February 22nd, 2021. This is your notice and reminder that this meeting is being electronically recorded. At this time, we'll start with open forum. Is there anyone who would like to address the committee at open forum tonight? All right, I'm getting a no from AACS. Thank you, Mr. Jones. That will close open forum. We will move on to our business agenda tonight, and I will turn it over to the superintendent for his report.
Thank you, Chairman. First, I wanted to update the committee on current conditions in the district. The news there is generally good. We have some significant improvements since we last met. As I'm sure you're aware, the viral conditions in the city have seen a precipitous drop. First, we haven't looked at graphs in a while, but I thought that tonight might be a good time to just revisit them. The first graph that I would show you is the average daily cases, looking at it from the full perspective of all the way back to when this began back in April. And as you can see from this graph, we've really turned a corner and are seeing a pretty significant downward trend. That is good news for all of us. If you've just sort of hone in on the last 6 weeks, as we've done since September, you'll see there that that curve, same data set, but the curve looks a little bit flatter. When we look at just a 6-week interval, which, based on how much data you're showing, you can, as I'm sure you all can remember from statistics class, right? You can make a graph almost look like anything if you want to. And I'm sure that'll be up any second. Maybe not. There it is. So the latest data, 31 average daily cases for 100,000. So that's a significant improvement over the last 6 weeks. Only 6 weeks ago, we were still at 57. So this is the kind of trend we want to see. And it's good reason to believe that after a steady 6 weeks decline like this, we have good reason to believe that that's going to continue unless the emergence of variants change things entirely. And then the last graph is our positivity rate. And the significant news here is that not only do we see a decline here like we do in the average daily cases, but we have crossed a threshold under the current state guidelines. That red line represents the threshold for hybrid instruction for communities that have between 10,000 and 50,000 residents. Obviously, Attleboro falls into that. But I would remark that I'm sure everyone understands that it doesn't magically work that, whether you have 10,000 people or 49,000 people, that's exactly the same. And then if you just happen to have, 1,000 more people, suddenly you jump to a completely different situation. It's obviously a gradual scale from a small community to a large community. And so as much as we are clearly in the category of 10 to 50, we're very close to the 50 line. And so I think we should note that if we had, even 5,000 more people in the city, we would be looking at the orange line, which is the over 50,000 threshold. So because we're so close to that, I think both numbers matter in our own deliberations. But the significant news is that at 4.49, we have crossed that red line for the first time since the fall. So on all the metrics we've been tracking, the good news is that we have turned a corner and continue to drop. And I would say that there's reason to believe that that steep decline is going to continue, right? So remember that the way they calculate this is they look at 2 weeks worth of data. So last week's data always is there with the most recent week's data. So when you add a new week, that new week's data is moderated by the previous week. So, as you get farther and farther away from those peaks, it can actually drop faster and faster. And that's what we're seeing in the data. That said, we have not seen changes in our staffing issues. We are still seeing plenty of positive cases among our staff. We still have plenty of quarantines. We still don't have subs. And it is still a daily challenge in our schools to ensure that there's an adult in front of every group of children. And as I talked about, I believe in the last meeting, while we are accomplishing that, it's not without a price, right? We are pulling staff members who have responsibilities to cover classes. And that means that the work that they would have done, which we value, which is why they're doing it, isn't getting done. And that's overall leads to a learning environment that is somewhat hampered by our staffing problems. So we've yet to see a change in that condition. And certainly we'll report that to the committee when that stops being the challenge that we've been facing since basically Thanksgiving. And the final thing is this should be the last time I have to mention temperatures, which is to say that we are past the coldest part of the year. As we were heading up to it, I reviewed temperatures and told us what average temperatures were like. We luckily had an unprecedented string of warm weather in January. We did have some cold in February, but it wasn't particularly unseasonably cold. And from here on in, things should get warmer. Now, as we saw in Texas last week, just because things usually are a certain way doesn't mean that you can't have a surprise weather event. So I can't say that, we're completely out of the woods. I mean, I'm sure many of us remember the great April Fool's blizzard. So, we're a long way away from, saying winter's behind us. But in terms of what we should be able to expect based on the forecasting also that the National Weather Service is providing, I don't think that temperatures are something that are likely to be a problem for us moving forward. I think we've passed that phase of the challenge. And certainly, if we have a cold snap that's unexpected, we'll certainly talk about that and inform people about that. But I believe we've gotten through the temperature and we can stop worrying about that. And this will be the last time I hope that I have to even mention that. So our outlook for all this information is that there's real reason to believe that things are going to continue to improve and that we as a district need to start planning in earnest for a reality in which our numbers are below the thresholds that we've been monitoring throughout the pandemic. So that is the stage that we're operating at. And I have quite a bit to talk about when it comes to that, which I'll get to now. So the first thing is, I just wanted to give you an update on our testing program, which we continue to be excited about and proud of. We have tested just under 2,000 people. This will be the first week that we get to test both cohort A and B in the same week. So that'll be a new mark for us. And we're pretty excited about that. As you know, from the two pools that we did test before vacation, those again, almost 2,000 people, we did have one positive pool. And to me, the most exciting part of that news is that it really is statistically what you would expect to be the case. And that suggests that the modeling and the way we're thinking about this is, being borne out by the actual experience and the data that we have. So, as much as it's really good news that we had so few positive cases. I know a lot of people believe that there were going to be significantly more cases. I think some people counter with, well, you're only testing about, a third of the students, which at this time is the case. So yes, until we bring up our numbers, we can't be absolutely confident that what we're seeing in this data is representative of the entire district. Some people have remarked to me that, oh, well, the people who are most conscientious about these things are the people who are the most eager to test. And so that skews your results. And really, the people that are going to bring the numbers in a different direction are the ones that are resisting. I mean, that may or may not be true. We can sit here and argue that point, but the best way to solve that concern is to get everyone tested. And if we get our participation rate up, then we can have greater confidence in what our data means. But just the idea that, with the sample we had, 2,000 people is not a small sample of people, right? That's a significant number. And that sample size produced a result that's completely in match with what you would expect is a strong suggestion that our ideas about what's going on match what actually is going on. So that's really good news. The other thing that I would let you know about testing is that we expect at the end of the week to receive new saliva-based PCR tests. And these tests will be used as a backstop for when rapid antigen tests do not produce a positive result. So, in most cases, when we have a positive pool, when we do the rapid antigen testing, we will get a positive, and that's the person who caused the pool to be positive. We know, what the source of the infection was. And so, mystery solved, and we're all safer as a result of knowing. But we've learned from other communities that occasionally you can have everyone in the pool test negative, even though the pool came back positive. And this can happen because the pool testing is a more sensitive test than rapid antigen testing. Now, rapid antigen testing turns out to be a better measure than we originally thought and is likely to catch most cases. There seem to be, based on the evidence, that there are some people who, and especially in kids, that we have people who are asymptomatic, and because they are so asymptomatic, they do not test, they do not come out as a positive on the rapid antigen test. Now, the state's stance on this is that this isn't a problem. If you're so asymptomatic that you do not test positive on the rapid antigen test, the state's guidance is that's not a problem because you're not infectious. Now, I'm not a doctor. I don't know how confident we can be in that, but that is their message to us. They say, if everyone comes back negative, move on with your lives. Our concern around that is that we really want to, hone in and figure out where our positives are. So these saliva PCR tests will allow us to, when we have everyone test negative, we can do a follow-up individual PCR test using the saliva test, send those back to the lab, and within a day or so, we should know exactly who the person in the pool was. That'll give us better information, and it'll also take the guesswork out of it. I think it'll really, put people's minds at ease and help us to have greater confidence in our testing program. So that's coming later this week, and we hope to have that all in place for next week. So I'll be crossing my fingers that if we have any pools that are positive this week, and with both cohorts being tested, I would expect that we would have at least one positive pool. Hopefully that when we do the rapid antigen testing, someone will test positive like we did last time, and then we can move on with our lives. But there is a chance that this week, if we have everybody come back negative, we don't have those saliva tests in place yet. So this will be 1 week where we don't have that safety precaution in place, but starting next week, we should.
Ms. Larson?
I agree. I think it's all very good news. And I know you've been in touch with some other districts that have been doing this for a few more weeks than we have. In those conversations, you get the feel that, I guess I'm trying to decide, after doing it for a couple of weeks, I would think that you start to find all the asymptomatic people that we've been kind of looking for. And do their numbers go down after that, or do they basically just stay steady? Or
So
would the expectation be that every 2,000 people we're going to find one pool, or do you kind of weed them out after a few weeks of testing? Or
Yeah, so I don't think it's a process of weeding out, because you would only test positive as an asymptomatic person for a period of time relative to when you were infected. So although sometimes people can skew a pool test result, even if they're past their infectious period, just because anyone who ever had the disease could do that. So I guess there's a little bit of that, but more so, I think that the number of positive pools you have really reflects the viral conditions in the community. And so based on the experience in other communities, though they were testing during a higher rate of infection than what we're anticipating to be next month. So I think we would expect there to be a drop off in positive pools, probably because of both factors.
Mr. Storrs, do you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Superintendent, I understand that some neighboring communities have gotten to the point where they've brought the students back full in person. And also that there was a recent change to the requirements regarding transportation
Yes.
as far as the social distancing requirements. So it sounds like, I'm looking for details, that the transportation is less of a concern as it previously was. While right now, the issue, of course, would still be the classroom social distancing and then how to deal with things like lunch and stuff like that. But now that we are heading in the directions that we are, that the vaccines are in place, that we have the pool testing and all these other things are happening, we need to start actually having conversations about what it will take to bring our students, maybe not the ones that are in the virtual academy, but the cohorts A and B, combining them into a full-time in-person structure. What would it take for that to be possible?
Yeah, so that's sort of where I'm going to land in my presentation. I want to go over some of the things that you just touched on, and then be happy to engage in a conversation about that.
Mr. Geddes?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very quickly, and I apologize if I missed this when you were talking initially about testing, but have you seen, I know you had mentioned that you expected after a couple of weeks of testing that we would see an increase in participation. Has that started to come true, or?
It has, but our hope here is that especially after this week where we've got both cohorts done in 1 week, we'll have done it this now, 4 different times, that we can use the success we've had from that to really make a second push with families to consider participation. And we're going to just have to keep whacking away at that throughout the spring.
Thank you.
Mr. Domenici?
Thank you. Just a couple of quick questions, Dave. Just to confirm, are we talking about an average of 10 tests per pool? Is that about right?
That's probably pretty close to what's true now, but we have the capacity to put as much as 20 per vial. So as more people participate, we're actually not going to see an increase in pools by all that much.
And then my other question is, I think as the follow-up, right? When you did the rapid antigen testing on the pool, there was 1 positive test.
In that pool, yes.
Right. So overall, we're talking 2,000 tests, 1 positive test out of 2,000.
Correct.
That's just fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
It's very encouraging.
Yeah.
All right, so this is testing, I would say on the whole is good news all around. To switch subjects to vaccinations, here the news is not so good. For reasons that I can't explain or justify, K-12 education has been moved in the phase plan by the state to phase 3. This change isn't significant because we were next when we were in phase 2, and now that they've taken us out and put us at the top of phase 3, we're still next. So that's not a big alteration. I think the timeline is a concern. I have not heard a definitive date that we should be expecting this, but I'm hearing from multiple sources that this might be as much as a month away before teachers have access to the vaccine. That timeline, of course, is disappointing to us, and we think that it doesn't quite reflect everyone's claims to prioritizing a return to school. But honestly, the most troubling news over vacation was the news that municipalities will no longer be receiving vaccines. This is a tremendous setback to our plans to return school kids back fully in person, because it takes away our ability to control for ourselves access to the vaccine in a way that we can ensure that the right groups of people have the vaccine to promote bringing back groups of students that we can plan for and to match good practice based on, discussions about what we want to do. And as I've said multiple times now, we believe that we should be prioritizing our youngest students, that the impact on them is the most negative of all of our students. There's a burden for everyone involved, but if I had to say which group is hit hardest by this, it is the youngest children. And our plan was to vaccinate those educators among the first ones, because that would then give us a real justification for being able to make concrete plans that we could really, communicate and get everybody ready for, and we would be in control of our destiny. And the state has taken that away from us, quite frankly. I cannot relay how disappointed I am at this decision and how much it throws something that we had planned for a measure of control over into something that we no longer control. Now, educators will still have access to the vaccines. They'll be asked to go to the mass vaccination sites. Gillette is obviously the most proximate one. I believe they're opening up another one in Dartmouth for some of our employees that might be closer to home. So there'll be an option, and if you want to drive farther away, you can. As lots of people will tell you, that process of securing an appointment has been very, very frustrating for people who do become eligible. And now, on top of everything else, rather than being able to receive vaccines from the state and tell our educators, okay, as a group, we can vaccinate you on this date and take that part of the planning out of it. This is now going to be thrown back onto teachers to fend for themselves, to figure out how to work that system, to get an appointment in a fashion that suits their schedule. It's really, really going to slow down our ability to act as swiftly as we were hopeful we would be even just a week ago. So that's the news on the vaccine front. I don't know if anybody has any questions about that specifically.
Is there been any guidance on what the timeline is for, was it 3A? Is that what the K through 12, that
Yep.
group is, when that'll be
So
started?
we're
when-
next.
When it would finish?
But they just started this phase, which is what, 2B?
Right.
So, based on the experience with the over 75 crowd, right? It's at least a couple weeks. And I believe that the over 65 crowd is considerably larger. So it probably will take longer. So I don't think there's any reason to believe that we're going to be that our eligibility will be opened up before 3 weeks from now. And some people are estimating more like 4 or 5.
I guess what I struggle with in what you said is the idea that it gets thrown back on the employees to make the arrangements themselves, because that's, I guess it makes it harder for the district, but everyone's struggling to do that. That's the reality of what we're facing in getting the vaccine. So
Yes. And as I plan to get into, it's against what the CDC's guidance was, that came out just before vacation.
has there been any, what has been the guidance from the state on the necessity of vaccinations of teachers to get back in school? Because I know that that's something that seems to be changing, as time goes on.
Yeah, we're still awaiting written guidance from the state on this, although the governor's comments have been that it's not necessary.
Mr. Minister?
Just real quick, we have state reps that have been very good about advocating on our behalf, whether it's funding or others. Has there been some discussions to try to get a push for reconsideration at the state level?
I know that there's been considerable pushback from communities to the state. I can't say specifically about our representatives about what they have or haven't said, but to this point, it seems like the state is pretty set in its ways and thinks that this is the best way to do it. And I do understand that, there probably are, communities that haven't handled that responsibility in the way that the state wants, and that it's, creates a complication. But I don't know. I think that Attleboro's success thus far would have been a reason to let us to continue to operate. I believe the threshold, don't quote me on this, but I think there's something like you've got to be able to deliver 760 doses a day to be considered eligible to continue to be a site. And, that's Gillette is the kind of place that does that.
Mr. Gillis?
I know that not all of the educators opted into the testing. So is there a sense as to how many educators would plan to get vaccinated?
We did do a survey of our staff, and an overwhelming percentage in the 90s said they plan to get the vaccine.
Thank you.
Okay. Moving on, the state did release new transportation guidelines. Effectively, they removed distancing as a concern on buses. I can't say that I fully understand how we went from, zero, from the stringent rules that we have now to basically go back to normal. There are a couple, you have to leave windows open. You can't put more than 2 high schoolers on a bench. I mean, we don't know. These are things that don't really have much of an impact. So I think the big takeaway on the transportation guidelines is that, as we've talked about on many occasions, transportation was one of the obstacles to a return, and the state has effectively removed it. I mean, what the new guidelines really don't pose much of a challenge. I'll just turn this over to Mr. Furtado a second to speak a little bit more in detail about that.
Yeah, the new guidelines, especially given the trend we're seeing in Attleboro's infection rate, is essentially remove any distancing requirements on a bus. It maintains masking, maintains keeping the windows open, but buses can essentially operate normally going forward.
So, we'll have decisions to make about that when we get into a conversation about a return to full in person, but, I've said all along, we should follow guidelines, and in this case, the guidelines do not present any further problems with transporting our students. So that obstacle has been removed. I wanted to, as promised, provide a little bit of a summary of the CDC guidelines that were released just prior to vacation. The first thing I think everyone has to understand is that while we make sure that everything we do is in keeping with the CDC guidelines, ultimately we follow DESI's guidelines, right? And Massachusetts has set its own guidance that we've been operating from all along, and that'll continue to be the case. So really, those guidelines don't change anything in this moment. But certainly the state is going to change its guidelines. We know that transportation was just the first shoe to drop. There will be other changes. And I'm sure they were waiting to see what the CDC said before they made their changes. So I think we can anticipate their changes to come. And when that happens, then those will be the new rules that we have to follow. But I do think it was important for us to go through the new guidance and try to make sense of it, and in the anticipation, because I don't think the state's going to stray too far from that. So the first thing is the new guidelines talk about the importance of layered mitigation strategies, right? So it's not any one thing that makes the difference. The reason why so many people are claiming that schools are safe, as has been our claim throughout all of this, is that, when you follow all of the strategies, right, the collective effect is what makes the difference, not just, any one of them. And to just remind everybody, what they talk about in the guidelines are masks, distancing, sanitizing hands, coughing etiquette, cleaning, ventilation, and contact tracing with resulting quarantines and isolation, right? So those are all things that the Attleboro Public Schools do and have done throughout the pandemic, and probably explains why, as we sit here today, and I know people's objections to the contrary, from the state's perspective, we have had 0 cases of in-school transmission. So these are the mitigation strategies that the CDC is recommending, and they are the ones that we follow. Based on the new CDC guidance, we would be rated as a community with moderate transmission. And they define that as 10 to 49 average daily cases per 100,000. As we talked about earlier, we have 31 these days. And so that's, right in the meaty part of that range. And so it's that number, or either one, a positivity rate somewhere between 5 and 7.9%. As we talked about, we have just fallen below 5%. So, we're not moderate on both measures. We're only moderate on one. We're less than moderate, whatever that. I guess I should make transmission, I know what it is, low transmission, excuse me. So, one of our ratings is low, the other one's moderate. That makes us moderate. So what does moderate mean? Well, honestly, if you read their, the rating system, they say that all transmission levels can consider full in person. They do talk about how when you get up past moderate into higher levels, hybrid becomes something that they are recommending as a consideration, but not too different from what we've talked about all along, is they're looking at staged, you're phasing in aspects of what you're doing slowly over time rather than going all or nothing all at once. I thought most interesting about their guidelines is their stance on distancing. So I did want to share with you the graphic that's in their materials. This is their sample classroom. The first thing I would point out to you is I'm not sure if you can read those numbers from here. I can't, but I do know what they say. It's a 30 by 30 classroom. And while we do have some classrooms in the district that are that large or larger, a majority of our classroom spaces are smaller than 30 by 30. So this is larger than your average Attleboro classroom. And I'm sure you know, class sizes in Attleboro are higher than the average across the state. So what's really interesting here is they make a pretty clear stance about 6 feet. They say that 6 feet is proper distancing. And in their example of what a classroom at 6 feet looks like, if you notice, they fit 9 desks in the classroom. So to me, there's a little bit of a mixed message in all of this. They tell us, it's safe to bring everybody back, but to be safe, you need to keep your distance. Oh, and by the way, in a 30 by 30 classroom, that means 9 kids. Now, if you read the fine print, they have the little numbers, and you can go in and say, this says, well, 6 feet, but if you're moderate or low, which we are, they say you should do so to the greatest extent possible. So that's pretty similar language to what Massachusetts has been operating under since August, right? Which is 6 whenever possible, as no less than 3 feet, right? That's what Massachusetts has been doing all along. I thought they came in stronger on 6 feet than Massachusetts does, but ultimately, they give themselves the out with low and moderate transmission to not do 6 feet, which, I don't understand the mixed message that they're sending when they hold this up as a model classroom and they're telling you, yeah, at 6 feet, you can only fit, 9 desks, which is not too far from the real experience, right? There are very few situations in which fitting our entire class into a room at 6 feet is feasible. We've talked about that multiple times. So the distancing is ultimately going to be, I think, the crux of what we have to decide about is, what we think is the right threshold to live by. I think that ultimately is where we're going to have quite a bit of discussion as a district. The other things I would mention about the CDC guidance, they talked extensively about the importance and value of both testing and vaccinations. But they do, in the end, say they should not be considered conditions for reopening, which is to say that they're important. You should have them, but they are not required. I would point out that in the CDC guidance, they recommended that educators be vaccinated in phase 1B. That's their recommendation right after healthcare workers. They suggest that educators should be treated like first responders. As we already talked about, in Massachusetts, we're 3A. So, we're not in keeping with the guidance from that perspective as a state. They do really emphasize the importance. We talked about those mitigation strategies and how it's layers of protection, and they felt like they emphasized that vaccination is one of those important layers. And I think that that's something that we have to talk about pretty extensively. And the final thing is they make the point that states should make it as easy for teachers as possible to get the vaccine, and that as much as possible that vaccination clinics should be as close to where teachers are as possible. So, that's another way in which I think we've really whiffed in supporting this particular concern. The last thing I would say about what the CDC guidance does say is it makes a very strong point about how the age of students matters. That they are pretty emphatic that there are fewer risks with younger children, right? The closer to adult size the kids get, the more that they face the same level of risk as any other adult. And the farther away from that, the smaller they get, the more that there does seem to be a lessened risk. And I would remind everyone that our data for all the cases that we've had shows the same pattern, right? That the older kids, we've had more cases than the youngest kids. The last thing I'll say about the CDC is that is something that they didn't talk about, which is how to handle lunch. I know that this seems like almost a trivial thing to get caught up on, especially when our mission is about education, but the logistics of lunch are still a significant problem, one that Commissioner Riley has on the conference call with superintendents admitted that he's not sure the state has a good answer for this one yet. And I thought it was interesting that the CDC said nothing about it. Because if you really think through how difficult it is, because just to remind everybody, to eat, you have to take your mask off. And so that means that everyone has to be at 6 feet. And as we've already talked about, we don't fit everyone at 6 feet. So there's real problems with lunch on the whole. So that's an unaddressed problem, but we'll be waiting to hear what the state has to say, what its response is and what its guidelines are. And when we have those, certainly we'll be talking about what we should do as a result of the state's approach to these concerns. While we wait for those guidelines, we're not going to just do nothing. We're going to continue to do several things. One of those is that we have already scheduled to begin a reopening discussion with our unions. It's important to us that our educators have say in the decisions that we make on how to keep them safe and how to best operate our schools under these challenges. They're the ones that have to deliver. And I know that there is great concern about getting us back, but we have to do it in a way in which there is confidence that we're all going to be successful and safe. Because in the absence of that, we can all be here, but that doesn't mean that we're going to be successful while we're together. So it's really important that teachers have say in this, and we're beginning that process immediately, even though we don't know exactly what the rules are yet, because there's plenty we can start talking about in preparation so that when we have the rules, we'll be in a position where we can start acting faster than we would be otherwise. I would also say that we're going to begin a process by which we identify where our space problems are. When we talked about space in the district back in August as part of the reopening, this was all new territory. I think everyone can appreciate that we did not think through everything because we had never done any of this before. Now, several months later, it's pretty clear to us that we're going to have a conversation about this, not level by level or even building by building, but grade by grade within each building. I know for a fact that there are grades in this district that fit in the buildings that they're in at 6 feet of distance. There's just lower class sizes as it's just a fluke result of the enrollment in that building. And based on the size of the classrooms in that building, we'll be able to actually bring that grade in at 6 feet without much trouble. Likewise, we know there are grades in certain buildings that, because we love to pack them in at 28, are not going to fit not only at 6 feet, but in some cases they don't fit at 3 feet. And so we need to, as quickly as possible, really get our heads around where our problems are, where they aren't. And we're better prepared to do that now than we were in the summer. So that's a piece of information that we'll be sharing with the committee in a short amount of time to inform you about, what that looks like and how much of a problem we have. And it's going to really drive our discussion about what we can and can't do based on whatever the new guidelines are. Of course, we're going to continue, as we talked about, to push for participation in testing. 33% is not enough to make the case that our testing program is ensuring our safety. We want to get it up to 100%. And I've asked multiple times for someone who has more authority and more expertise in this to, help us determine what a fair threshold would be. As soon as I get an answer on that, I'll certainly share it. But I promise you, 1/3 of the district is not going to be enough. And so we really, really, really need to convince parents to participate because, part of what's going to make the school safe is knowing definitively when there's virus in the school. And we're going to have to work with the teachers to figure out, how we're going to handle the new news about vaccination. There isn't much we can do, but there's no harm in trying to talk these things out and see what we can do to support the need to have our teachers vaccinated. I mean, that's another essential part to being safe and secure. So we'll be working all these things and preparing because we believe in the coming weeks, we're going to be facing new guidelines and the committee will be expecting the administration to make recommendations about how we should proceed based on that information. That's our responsibility. And we plan to be prepared to tell you all what we think we can and what we can't do, as realistically as possible, so that you can make the difficult decision of what course we take as we get from here to the end of the school year.
Stores?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in relation to my question before, so if the guidelines do not change, are we indicating that we feel that there's no way with where things are right now and where we think things are going to be in 2 weeks, a month, or what have you, that students would be able to come back before the end of the year if the guidelines did not change?
I would not say that there's no way.
Okay.
No. But I would say that if, there are places where we can look and say that there's a higher probability than others, right? I still think there's more opportunity to bring back our younger students than in other places. And likewise, there still remains the most significant obstacles to coming back at the high school level. And, in its bullishness about 6 feet, the CDC does say, all right, well, to the fullest extent possible. But then when they define what that means, they say, we'll do things like cohort students and, keep them separate. Well, those are things we can do K-8, but obviously we can't do at the high school. So in many ways, I don't want to, put myself in a corner for when the guidelines come out. But as I sit here tonight, I cannot imagine the conditions under which we'll be able to bring high school students back fully in person this school year. Now, if things change so dramatically that, I eat those words, I'll be happy. I mean, we want to bring kids back, but it's just really, really hard to imagine enough things falling into place for that to happen. So I think there are parts of the district that it seems unlikely to me, but there are other parts where I think there are cause for hope. And, we're going to be pursuing as much as possible, but again, as to do so in a way that's safe and going to be successful.
Was that answer? I'm sorry, Jim.
No, okay.
With you find it hard to see the high school if the guidelines don't change, or is that just overall your gut right now?
I can't imagine what anyone would say to make that a thing that we could pull off, right? Like, I mean, they'd have to come in and say, you don't have to, you don't have to keep 6 feet of distance at lunch, right? I mean, or we'd have to say that there's distancing doesn't matter anymore because, again, I don't think you can schedule the high school and even make sure that everybody's at 3 feet with everybody fully back. So, based on what seems possible in the next few months, because remember, I mean, this is the end of February, right? We only have 2 more real stretches in this school year, from here to April break and then the April break to the end. And that all goes very, very quickly. And there's diminishing returns at some point, right? Like, as we talked about last time, I don't know, I don't think we would make a major change in how we're delivering instruction in June. So there's limited time and we have limited capacity to plan for a transition. So given all the things that are being discussed by, say, the CDC and the state, what seems possible in the near term, I don't see rules coming out that make high school a possibility. But, you know, that's as I sit here today. I've been wrong about a bunch of things, so maybe I'll be wrong about that.
So to follow up, looking at our different student populations, you know, trying to think about the ones that need the in-person learning more than others, especially special needs. Could we move, do you foresee a possibility to move forward with those populations?
Yeah, I mean,
Sooner than later.
our high needs population are largely in 4 days a week currently.
Right.
So, you know, we're already pretty close to there on that front. And yes, you know, again, I would say everyone equally needs to be back fully in person.
Sure.
But I think some groups bear the weight of being in hybrid more than others. And so, you know, yeah, the youngest kids I think are the hardest hit by this. You know, as has been pointed out to me on multiple occasions, I'm past the stage of having a 5-year-olds at home. But it's my impression that those that do find remote to be particularly challenging. And I believe the teachers equally find that challenging. You know, it's not an age that's really conducive to that kind of education. Whereas, you know, as the committee learned in having the forums with the educators, you know, the older the kids got, the more the teachers made the case that in many ways remote was a better option educationally for the kids than hybrid is. And, you know, I don't think that they're wrong about that in the sense that if our only concerns are educational, and as we've talked about on many occasions, that isn't our only concern. We're more than just that. But our chief mission is education, and it is easier to teach, you know, to deliver the content in a remote fashion with, you know, 17-year-olds. So that's one of the difficulties of the district is that we're so complicated. We have so many different things going on that it's just really hard to talk about anything in a way that, you know, really applies to everybody in every situation.
Yeah. And the last one that I had is with, you know, I know that there was talk about hoping the state would get away from standardized testing this year, being the conditions that they are, but I guess that fails. Money is always a, you know, driving factor in my opinion, but cohort A and cohort B, how do you do standardized testing? Has there been any guidance regarding that? Or is there any understanding? Because everybody has to take the test at the same time kind of situation. How do we do that?
Yeah, so there have been some guidance on this, and maybe Ms. Regan can jump in, but, you know, fundamentally that they've narrowed the test. So testing doesn't quite have the same burden. And so, you know, we are fully preparing to have to test in a hybrid mode. That's another complicating factor. You know, the testing window is pretty wide, even with a reduced testing load. And to try to transition from being in a hybrid mode to fully in person in the middle of testing is another obstacle to the whole thing. You know, this sort of state did this to themselves, right? Like if our biggest concern was getting kids fully back, then they would have cleared the deck for us to make that the top priority. But they said, nope, you got to do testing too. And so that becomes a challenge too. I don't know what else you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Superintendent Sawyer. Pretty much all of April and May are consumed by administering tests. And then another complicating factor for us is having the ABA students come in on Wednesdays to take it in person as well, because it is all online. So.
All right, thank you.
Ms. Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, there's so many different moving pieces to this. And like you said, the layered mitigation strategy that we've been using has been so helpful, I think, in reducing the spread. You know, the 6 feet of distance, because, you know, typically 6 feet is the distance before respiratory, for respiratory transmission. The masks as another layer, the ventilation as another layer. So I agree with what you say about lunch being a really big logistical issue. As we know, as the kids get older, their transmission rate is similar to that of adults. We need to keep our staff safe. We've already been asking so much of them, and this is so frustrating, the whole situation with the vaccine. I'll just leave that there. So I agree, there's so many things we need to consider, and our different populations have different needs. So you had said earlier that one of the studies you're going to do is about the distancing. What can we actually handle, what some of these parameters for us to use? When do you expect to have that completed? Because that's, I get it, that's a huge undertaking. Is that something that we could expect at our next meeting?
My hope is to have that completed for the next meeting.
Okay, I appreciate it. That's, if there's any way we can get any sort of preview, I think that would be great, just for us to kind of,
Yep.
you know, hit that around in our noggins for a little bit. Yeah. All right,
Absolutely.
thank you.
Mr. Gettis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And along those lines, what's the timeline for your discussions with the AEA and the APA?
So we're going to have a preliminary conversation because again, we don't really have details to negotiate over, and you know, it's a bit premature, but we felt like it was worthwhile to get in a room and start to talk out what our concerns are from both sides. And through that conversation, identify what some possible issues might be. And that's starting this week.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, the only other thing I would say just would be to, you know, thank you for the detailed report. It's clear you guys are putting a lot of thought into this. You know, I think it's important to that we do it, and then the community knows that the work's being done, because, you know, as the virus levels dip and the push in the community to return in person gets louder, what I wouldn't want to see happen is have those numbers drop and have the guidelines change, and then we're not able to adapt with, you know, with the changes. I mean, that's been something that we've been able to do so far, and it seems clear to me you guys are preparing for that possibility. So I would just say keep that up.
Will do.
Gettis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and great point that I completely agree with. One other question I did have that I almost forgot to ask. In yesterday's Sun Chronicle, or on their website yesterday, they put up an article about the King Philip School Districts participating in a partnership to support student mental health during this year because of COVID. Has there been any investigation into any similar partnerships with us, or do we know what type of costs might be associated with that?
I didn't catch that article, so I can't speak to it, but
One of the grants that just came out, the new ESSER 2 grant that Commissioner Riley just released from DESE, has some certain stipulations in there where a certain amount of money is allocated directly for social emotional health and social emotional learning. And so we will be looking into that as well.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep.
all right, so then to shift gears, it's time for our budget presentation, which, as you know, normally would have done by December, but this year is not like a normal year. So this was as soon as it made any sense to do this presentation. I'm going to turn this over to Ms. Regan and Mr. Furtado. I think that you've all heard enough of me talking for the last several months. Thought it would be good to hear from somebody else.
Thank you, Superintendent Sawyer. Tonight, we'll review the FY22 budget development and priorities. So for the overview, first, I'd like to acknowledge that, can you hear me? Okay. I'll try to be louder.
Thank
First, I'd like to acknowledge that we're coming on a one-year anniversary for COVID forever impacting our lives, and not only personally, but also educationally for us. The other thing I want to acknowledge is that the situation is unprecedented, and the normal timelines and processes that we have become accustomed to have been completely interrupted by the pandemic. And so tonight, what we want to be able to do is provide you with as much information as we possibly can, sharing our goals, what our current budget looks like for this year, the FY22 projections, and how we'll be able to move forward from here. So what are we trying to accomplish tonight? So for our goals, we first want to share once again how COVID has impacted our timelines and processes, how the state and gratefully the city have supported us with their grant related or ESSER funds or CARES Act funds given all of the extra expenses that we've had to take on this year due to COVID. But even with all of that support and that help, we still find ourselves with quite a bit of liabilities. The other goal that we have tonight is to establish how the governor's projections for FY22 have impacted our current proposal, and also how we plan to prioritize student learning given a full year of the pandemic. So Mr. Potato is going to explain the budget process for us.
Thank you, Assistant Superintendent Regan. As this committee knows, and as we've worked very diligently with in finance, we didn't even receive this year's budget until December. So prior to that, we were working off of FY20 numbers on a monthly basis. And it's been a lot of work to sort of catch up and understand and project where we're going to be, given all the challenges that we do have and all of the various sources of funding that have been made available to us, as Lori pointed out. I want to kind of foreshadow things. The 22 budget, governor's budget has been presented. That is, or was constructed using our current enrollment data, which is dramatically impacted by COVID. I'll get into those numbers in a second. But it's significantly impacted our foundation budget for next year. And as I said, we have received a lot of grant support. However, the grants have restrictions and make operating difficult. So we're grateful for it. We've been able to expend funds, as I will show you, but our operating challenges haven't been able to be overcome yet. So where are we now in FY21? This is from last year's presentation. You know, we have a net school spending number of about $77.8 million. On top of that, we have another $4 million in transportation for our $81 million $800,000 budget. Grant support in the current year, we received a CARES Act grant for $1.9 million. That grant, when it was presented to us, had a deadline of December 2020. We worked very hard to make sure we completely exhausted the funding. We certainly knew we needed it. We had a whole distance learning program that we had to establish and create. Obviously, had a lot of building issues that had to be addressed, had PPE issues that had to be addressed. So we weren't overly challenged in spending the money. But as the end of the year drew close, the federal government and the state worked on extending that deadline. We had already fully expended our grant. So those monies are spent. They were extremely helpful, allowed us to get ahead of the curve in terms of getting our buildings and our PPE supplies in place before the start of the year. So the money was extremely valuable and fully expended. A second bucket of money was a technology grant that was critical for us because we were not in a state of being one-to-one and had the obligation of establishing a remote learning program over the summer. So that grant, same circumstances, came out with a deadline of December of 2020. We fully expended it to create the distance learning program we have. It was extended, but we had already expended those funds. And then finally, the city got a substantial $4 million CARES Act grant and were incredibly helpful and supportive in terms of both PPE and structural things we did in the classrooms and the offices, plexiglass, as well as the committee knows, provided air purifiers in every classroom in the district. Those expenditures total something over $2.5 million since the summer. However, COVID has impacted the district in some ways that have not been able to be addressed financially. And in particular, has to do with programs that run on revolving funds. Abacus, for one, had exhausted its budget to get through the spring and through the summer, had its budget surplus, if you will. So they're running on a negative basis in 21 and will need to be supported with operating monies to get to the end of the year. School lunch program is the same thing, runs on school lunch revolving funds. Had a substantial surplus and burned through that pretty quickly, and will need substantial help from the operating budget to get through to the end of the year. And then finally, we were hoping that the mild winter would continue. It has not, so we're still not quite sure as to where we're going to land in terms of utilities that are related to keeping more fresh air in our buildings while the students are in the buildings. Kind of a separate process we've undergone is a whole bunch of infrastructure, mechanicals, controls in our air handling systems in the district. We did not use grant funds for those things because we had other ways of dealing with that without having to expend operating money. So, we've done that and we continue to do that as the year goes on. Next year, we have both some assumptions and some grant availability. As Assistant Superintendent Regan pointed out, we have 2 ESSA grants that will be available in FY22 that are going to total about $3 million. I am on a webinar on the 4th with a change in the administration at the federal level. They are going to go over some new terms and conditions for these grants. The old terms and conditions, as I said, restricted our use for things like Abacus and things like school lunch. And we still have not gotten a clear answer on utilities. So we're going to see if these things change in a way that make them more helpful for the district. We also, intend on using these funds for things like testing in the new year. Additional cleaning and disinfecting, and then additional PPE and supplies. Health insurance, which is always a deep interest to the district in a budget process. We were very, very fortunate to get a call today from the city to indicate to us that the city right now, as they see it, do not anticipate there being any increase in health insurance rates for 22. And just for the committee's benefit, should an increase come through, any 1% increase on health insurance rates would equal about $130,000 in additional spending for the district. And then finally, the mayor's commitment to us to be above net school spending, as has been the case for many years now. So in working through our current state and using the contractual changes that are going to occur, our level service budget for next year would be about $84.4 million. With the assumptions we just discussed, and with, again, the use of the compromised COVID enrollment numbers to generate our foundation budget with the state, we would anticipate an actual appropriation of something around $83 million. So that puts us in a deficit position of about $1.5 million today, based on the governor's budget. As you know, there's a whole legislative process to go through. I will tell you that statewide, There's profound concern over the use of those enrollment figures. The Student Opportunity Act, which is part of the governor's budget, had anticipated to have a $300 million cost in year one, the implementation this year. Because of the enrollment numbers used, they actually only expended $198 million. So, people are aware of these kind of structural problems, and through the legislative process, they're going to have to determine whether or not in 23 they want to climb a massive mountain to do the funding that's necessary based on real enrollments, or make adjustments for 22 to prevent a substantial need for 23.
So the enrollment issue is statewide.
It's statewide. It's 32,000 students, I believe, statewide. So for Attleboro specifically, we were down 200 students, 100 kindergarten, which is reimbursed at a lower rate, and 100 students in the rest of our districts, for a total impact on our foundation budget of about $2.1 million. So had they used 19 enrollments, for example, our appropriation would be $2.1 million higher than we anticipate it to be now. And that $1.5 million deficit would be gone, and we'd have a surplus to enact some things that we would have to enact for, things like class size.
Ms. Larson?
I guess my first question is, where did they go? And if it's a statewide problem, where did they all go? Or are there just going to be less kids?
There are not going to be less kids.
I mean, this whole thing smells like the state can't count kids anymore.
No, I mean, I think that
I guess I'm just trying to.
We have a bunch of students whose families, decided to keep them at home, delay their enrollment for a year if they were, say, a kindergarten student, or if they were already in the district, not have them come to school this year, homeschool them. There's a whole bunch of things. Or on the other side of the coin, a lot of families had heard that private parochial schools may be going full time at the beginning, so they made those decisions as well. We certainly anticipate most of those, if not all of those students, coming back in September. So what districts in the state are going to see are 30,000 students more than the governor's budget reflects. So, districts across the state are going to be underfunded for the task at hand, in addition to all of the extra burdens that COVID presents.
I try to think the most polite way to ask this. Do they just not see this coming?
No, I don't think that's the case. I think that there is a robust debate right now saying, we know they're going to be there in September. We know that year 2 of the Student Opportunity Act is going to hit in 23. That gap is going to be significant. And we may be putting ourselves in a position where we're going to have trouble addressing the requirements in 23. So maybe we should make this adjustment now that we already know is about $100 million less than we anticipated.
with kindergarten, because that's about where half the students we lost are. And I've read an interesting article about that nationwide, in the idea of, with kindergarten, there's a lot of redshirting on a year-to-year basis anyway. So do we have an idea at all yet if we think that next year we're going to be seeing 100 more kindergartners just starting a year later? Are those kids going to be coming in first grade? Do we have any handle on that yet? And I realize that's really not a budget question, but
no, it's a concern that we as a senior administration have discussed at length, because the red shirt doesn't necessarily guarantee any kind of academic enterprise during that time. So that group is going to perhaps be behind their peers And, as was discussed already, there's going to be a significant effort at academic support to students like that.
Mr. Geddes?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned a number of students or a number of families putting students into private schools. And the kindergarten number, I think, is a confident number to bank on being there next year.
Right.
What are you using as indications that those other families would be back in Attleboro?
I don't have data to suggest, we've had, 80 families call up and say, oh my God, we made a mistake, we'll see you in September. But we do our what is generically called the schools attending report. We're in the middle of doing that right now. So we'll see those numbers sort of come out at us. And then what happens in, August when enrollments start, we'll see. And again, everybody is anticipating that's just going to be a very, very difficult time.
Just to piggyback on that, kindergarten enrollment will be having our kindergarten information night in the beginning of March. And then the online registration system will open up for incoming kindergarten families immediately following that. So we're hoping that a lot of families are actually waiting for this night and for the system to open up, and we'll be able to start to gather some data about how many actual kindergartners we will have in the system.
Sorry, just as a quick follow-up. Do you know when about those information nights will begin?
I don't have them off the top of my head. I don't want to give you the wrong date.
Okay. So like
I
week
can
of
get this.
March 1st or March 8th?
Yes, it's
Okay.
definitely in the second week of March.
Okay, thank you.
We've been posting it on our website. I can look it up in a minute and report back to you.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments on the budget? Have you been in, I shouldn't assume, have you been in contact with the city yet? I mean, I know you guys are constantly in contact with them about what our numbers are looking like based on what we're using as assumptions now.
Yes, I've been in contact with the budget director pretty regularly, as well as with the auditor. We're scheduling a meeting in a couple of weeks with the mayor and with the superintendent to kind of go over those details, as well as many coordination meetings and discussions for the grant funding. They've been extremely attentive and helpful, and want to make sure that everything is being done to meet our needs, knowing the circumstances everybody is in.
So to finish, are there any more questions?
I just had one, and do you have any idea about the, I know we mentioned the legislative process really hasn't taken place, right? So the Senate and the House will start looking at the budget, making adjustments. And sometimes, it tends to kind of help us a little bit. Do we have any idea on a timeline, since everything's kind of shifted, when we might know when that process is taking place? Or is that something we should just follow up with our state?
That's a great question. I think that there's a two-part answer. One is, I think the state process is pretty much on time this year. The governor announced his budget at the normal time. So I think overall we should expect, from a timeline perspective, a very normal process. I also believe the legislature is acutely aware of the deficiency in terms of the funding in the governor's budget. And I would imagine that, as you pointed out, we usually get a little help. I think there'll be more this year. I just can't imagine they're going to go forward with the way things are right now.
Yeah, I mean, I plan to reach out to Rep. Hawkins too, because he had mentioned previously with the Student Opportunity Act, they kind of, based on I guess the socioeconomic status of Attleboro and the percentages they use, we ended up getting less money than we were expecting to get even to kick off. And I'm hoping that perhaps that changes, and maybe that'll also help us.
Right.
But I just didn't know when they were going to start to even look at it and make recommendations.
Yeah, the timelines are pretty normal. So, they're going to have some answers in April, May, and then, make final choices in June, July.
Thank you.
Mr. Geddes?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My last question, numbers related to the budget. It seemed, as always, like the biggest changes are related to staff. we see cuts in staff where someone retires and we're bringing someone in at the bottom of the scale, or someone's coming in at the top of the scale where we had someone lower before. And that tends to be the case this year again. But I also noticed a lot of significant cuts continuing to happen in a number of different supply lines or professional development funds. What exactly do those, what's being lost in those cuts?
Some of those are, especially on the staff lines, like for PD, a reallocation of salaries. So we've done some changes, taking a position and creating a different position in a different place. So those budget dollars follow that.
Right.
So that does look a little funny there. Otherwise, there's been no significant difference other than the growth by contractual obligation for steps and lanes, offset, as you said, by retirements and departures.
But as far as like some of the supplies, like there may be a principal supply line that last year was $300, this year is $100, or.
Yes, so, yep, in that case, what we found is as we've added new assistant principals, especially at the elementary level, the professional dues and subscriptions for that person weren't calculated in because a lot of those changes came mid-year. So we adjusted, if you look at the dues and subscriptions line, you'll see that almost doubled. So it had to be offset somewhat by some other things, and that's where you see that impact.
Okay, so it's a similar reality.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, circling back to kindergarten information night, it is March 4th, and then the online registration will open up immediately following the next day. So families will be able to register.
Thank you.
The budget priorities. So what are our priorities? And given all that information, we certainly have really tried to streamline our goals and our priorities to be student focused, because we recognize that there are significant learning gaps and students are going to be needing more supports for social emotional learning and social emotional health as we move forward into next year. So as far as our main budget goals, as you know, for the past few years, our goal has been to reduce class size. And now, given our new reality in this pandemic, that still continues to be a main priority for us. As well as one new item that's on this slide is the pooled surveillance testing and reflex testing. As Superintendent Sawyer said when he was talking about the CDC guidance, this is just another layer or another strategy to complement all of the health and safety guidelines that we already have in place. And so we know that's something that we're going to need to continue to do moving forward. As far as our priority is concerned, as I mentioned, staff is the #1 priority, and thinking about closing the learning gaps for our students. There's been some significant conversation around providing summer programming as well as after-school programming for next year and planning for that. And then also thinking about the, as you already know, the continuation and refinement of the ABA, just to be able to better meet the needs of our students that are in the program. So what does this all mean, and what are the current takeaways? As Superintendent Sawyer said, and we've been talking about all along, we're waiting for further guidance from DESE so that we can continue to make plans moving forward for this year as well as for next year. Again, staffing is our top priority. And if there is one silver lining in all of this, it's that we were able to accelerate our one-to-one or our technology program for one-to-one in grades 5 through 12 and a modified program in K-4. And we also know that we have to wait for the budget to continue to go through the legislative process. And as we said before, we're not the only district in the Commonwealth that's facing this deficit. And we also know that there's significantly more to come. And here's the timeline that we were speaking about before. We expect this to be the timeline, but also recognize that nothing has been following exact timelines and processes this year either. So we hope that we'll be able to maintain this timeline. But also know that this will not be our last conversation about the budget moving forward. So.
Discuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Regan, you just mentioned ABA. It occurred to me, it just then occurred to me to ask this. We expect that a lot of the ABA teachers from this year will be back in buildings next year. Certainly not all of them. But when do we expect to have a better idea of how many ABA students we will have, which would dictate how many educators we would need? And what do we think right now that impact will be in terms of staffing in the building for next year, and how many more folks we would have to bring in?
Right, so I think we have to wait for the CDC guidance in order for us to be able to make plans for what next year looks like first. And then once we have that set in place, then we'll put together a process by which families can participate in there. And we'll be able to provide further information about that once it's all coordinated and organized, but we're in the process of doing that now and hope to provide more information to you within the coming weeks.
And sorry, quick follow-up. We know that there's been fluidity depending on the level of students that could go in or out of ABA. I know you haven't started the process yet, but are you able to make an educated guess as to how many families plan to stay in ABA? How many families think may have wanted to make the leap over and probably will next year, or they were on the wait list this year and they're just planning to be back in person next year anyway?
It's hard to make an educated guess right now, given there's so many unknowns. I'd be afraid to make a guess and then have it be completely off.
All right, no,
Yeah.
worries. Thank you.
Superintendent Sawyer, you had indicated before, though, that the idea was that the process, the guideline, not the guidelines, will be a little bit more stringent onto who was allowed to participate in the ABA going forward, correct?
Yes, we've been involved in discussions about what we're imagining, and we do need to see the guidance from the state before we can say anything definitively, but part of the things that we're preparing for behind the scenes is that we want to get ourselves ready so that when that comes out, we can have a discussion with the committee about perhaps setting some policy around, eligibility for the ABA moving forward.
Thank you. Mr. Larson?
That kind of addresses part of the question that I had, because my thought going forward that the ABA would be something that at some point we would start to wean off completely of, because I would think wanting to have all the kids that were in the building last year before COVID, and then, after, at some point in the fall next year, hopefully everybody will be vaccinated that's willing to be vaccinated. We can have everybody back and really just eliminate the extra expense of running two simultaneous parallel schools in person and AVA. So, I mean, I guess my hope was that, short of something extraordinary, that somebody couldn't return to a building.
Yeah, so I mean,
At some point in the not so distant future, the AVA would go away.
so as I've said in several settings, the AVA is never going to fully go away, because in many ways it's a good thing to have. It is an opportunity to solve a lot of situations that currently the district doesn't have a good answer to. So not only will it not go away fully, and one of the reasons why it will not go fully is under the CDC guidance, and I think the state will have the same stance. It will be for the foreseeable future. We're going to have to provide an option for students who, for their own medical reasons, cannot return to school, even though we can come back to full in person. I mean, that's a situation that's not going to change anytime soon. So we know that there are a number of students who, for medical reasons, either themselves or someone in their home can't come to school. So the ABA is going to exist for them in the short term, no matter what. And so for anyone listening at home that's worried about these changes, that option for that population is not going away. But from our perspective, there aren't 1,000 students in the district who the ABA is the best option for. And unlike in August when we didn't really know what to expect, we now know that we can offer school safely. And so for families that chose to go the ABA route, because that was an unsettled question at that time, which we understand and respect, and are going to, finish out the year for those families, no problem. Our message to them is that, you should return. So there's gonna be a significant reduction, but there will always be other situations in which the AVA is an appropriate approach for. And having a clear set of eligibility requirements for what kind of students would we consider putting in the AVA is something that we as a district should do and clarify very, very soon, so the families can know how they stand in relation to those new standards.
Just a follow-up, so that being said, if we have an AVA population of, say, 50 to 75 students spread over 12 grades,
Yeah,
conceivably, you could have some grades with nobody. You could
Correct.
have a grade with 10 across the district. You could have a grade of 2 people across the district.
exactly,
I
which
mean,
is why we can't run the AVA next year the way we are this year, because the scale doesn't work.
Right, I guess that's,
Yeah, no, I think
Kind
we
of
should
where
say
I'm-
that explicitly.
but-
So that's one of the things we're having a conversation about is what will it look like? Because I'm here to tell you, regardless of whether it's X or Y in terms of how many kids are in it, it's not going to be like it is this year. It can't be for the reason that you're stating.
well, just, in fairness to both the students and the staff involved, if you have a AVA situation where you've got a teacher-student ratio of 1 teacher to 2 kids, and you've got somebody at the high school who you've got 1 teacher who's got 28 kids. I mean, I don't want to be in that meeting. I know I will be, but I don't want to be. You know what I'm saying? There's an equality and an equity issue that,
Yep.
that we're going to have to address at some point in the future. I'm already
Luckily,
looking forward to it.
this has occurred to us already. And so what to do about it is still a work in progress. But, we're pretty confident that the AVA will exist next year. There will be students in it, but it's not going to be the experience that we had this year on several different levels.
I will patiently wait.
Mr. Storis.
So a couple of follow-up questions to that line of dialogue. So you foresee some level of ABA, 100 students less, whatever it is, it sounds like not just maybe next year, but in perpetuity?
Yes. Because we've always had students who, for medical reasons, had to take a break from school, sometimes as long as a year. There are situations in which students' needs can be better served in a remote setting than they can in school. That's a problem that we've always had. We've always wanted a virtual school as a solution. We lose some students to virtual schooling as a result of not having it as an option. So there are a lot of reasons why this is something we've wanted, and this is we've got it. So this is the moment to put it together in a way that makes sense. Now, what we had to do this year is never what we imagined. And as I think I've been clear about all along, haven't really enjoyed the experience of, and don't really think that we're serving kids in a way that we're comfortable with. Well, and I know that some people at home are really enjoying the AVA, and I'm not saying that it's not a success for anybody. And for some people are thriving in the AVA, which is proof that for some kids, it's a good option. But we do know that a lot of students are struggling, and that shouldn't surprise any of us.
But so to continue, so I understand, well, first let me say that this is a big deviation to what we've had in the past. So this is the first time I've ever imagined the idea that it's not going to go away. It's the first I'm hearing this, the first I've thought about this. Obviously, I would imagine, I'm not going to speak for my fellow colleagues, but I would imagine they all believe that at some point, generally, AVA would be dissolved, students would be back in school, and we would move going forward. Now, that doesn't mean that under certain circumstances, if there was an emergency, if there was a snow days, if there was this, that, we can institute some virtual learning. But I guess this is the first that I really thought that we would be doing this long term. Now, if you're saying just before, if you're saying that this is only going to be for a specific student population that meets certain guidelines,
Yes.
I can understand that. I think that's something that we would need to hear, that we would need to have a presentation on before we would I guess, sign off on this or,
No, I
feel this is
I
a
think we
done
need
deal.
to set policy about it, quite frankly.
Right.
And so it absolutely will be a matter before you, but,
okay.
and, you know, I forget where I say things, but I'm pretty sure I've said a couple times that this is not a thing that's ever going away.
Yeah, no, that's what I was gonna,
I
I've
guess I
heard him
took
say
that a
that
different way.
several times. I mean,
I took that as like, if there's a snow day, we might have an ABA, or if there's, you know, certain circumstances. I didn't think of it as a certain student population permanently virtual. That's different to me.
Yeah, I don't know that we have a lot of people who would be there permanently, but it as an option will be permanent.
Right, that I've always heard. But again, it sounds like there's a difference between the way I took it and the
Yeah,
way that you're
well,
thinking forward.
I'm glad we had the chance to clarify that. And again, very soon we'll be in front of you with some ideas about what that should be.
Mr. Domenici?
Yeah, I've always heard it that way. I've always advocated now that we have it, that it's a great tool to have. I clearly agree with that it can't be 1,200 students. But there's only 35 teachers covering those 1,200 students. So we don't have an issue of, because my kids are in it. So we don't have an issue of, you know, only 2 kids per teacher right now. We have 300 roughly middle school students with 8 teachers and 300 high school students with 8 teachers and about 19 teachers for 600 K through 4. There is some opportunity. I've actually had constituents where their kids are thriving. My kids are doing well. They can't wait to get back. But there are folks that it does thrive. So there are some opportunities. Obviously, it needs to be adjusted. Obviously, we need to talk about it. But I also recall there being a jump up to somewhere about 85 students in the Attleboro district that we went up from like 50 something to almost 85 kids going homeschool. Now we're losing that money entirely, 13,000 per kid. You offer an opportunity like ABA and perhaps we get to keep some of those. And maybe it ties in with the community academy. There's like a couple of different demographics of students where we're trying to keep these kids in school for different reasons. But yeah, 1,200 students, that's 20% of our population. That's not sustainable. You're running an entire, that's the size of a high school. You know, so yeah,
I mean,
there's definitely been a lot of challenges. But I think there's been successes. We don't hear about the successes as often as we hear about the challenges that folks have with not expecting, they didn't expect when they joined ABA, this is what was going to be.
yeah,
And it's hard.
the administration will be suggesting eligibility requirements that restrict the number of kids who are even considered for that. And, you know, again, for people who want to stay in the ABA next year, I can understand that that's a threatening message, but honestly, I'm hoping that the way we write this for the people that are served well by it for various reasons are still going to have it as an option. And the people who are not being served well by it, who are there because they're concerned about the safety of schools, I think we have to just, at this point, address the fact that that's no longer really a concern.
Agree.
And that, you know, it's time to come back for those families. And I know that that's going to upset some people, but, you know, I don't want to be dishonest about that with them if they happen to be listening.
Guess it'll be coming your way, Jim.
All right. Shannon,
Oh, no, I was going to echo exactly what Mr. Domenici said, that, you know, this is something, at least as I took it, this is going to be just another option as we grow and meet students where they are. Again, it's another potential stream that we're not going to lose our tuition for students who homeschool would have been their only option. Now they have another option. You know, and as we adapt and really push through resiliency, it's great to have all these other options. You know, I agree how it ran this year is not how we're going to have to do it in going forward. But the fact that the administration's been thinking about this already and about the parameters that we'll need going forward, I think this is going to be a wonderful option for the students, as you said, that do thrive in that particular or need that particular option.
That's the end of the budget presentation.
thank you. Anything else, Mr. Sawyer?
That concludes my report.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, we have minutes from our February 8th, 2021 meeting. The minutes were circulated with the packet. We have a motion to approve.
So moved.
Second,
Any discussion or edits? Ms. Johnson,
Yes.
Mr. Geddes,
yes.
Mr. Withers, yes. Mr. Larson?
Yes.
Mr. Storrs? Yes. Ms. Porto?
Yes.
Mr. Domenici?
Yes.
Mr. Hill?
Yes.
Ms. Sawyer?
Yes.
All right, motion passes. Thank you. Consent agenda, 2 items today. Motion to accept the donation in the amount of $10,000 from the Feinstein Foundation as broken down in the memorandum dated February 18th, 2021 from myself. And motion to accept a donation in the amount of $50 from Target to the Attleboro High School gifts donation line.
So moved.
Second.
Ms. Sawyer,
Yes.
Mr. Hill,
Yes.
Mr. Domenici,
Yes.
Ms. Porto.
Yes.
Mr. Storrs.
Yes.
Mr. Larson.
Yes.
Mr. Withers, yes. Mr. Geddes,
Yes.
Ms. Johnson.
Yes.
That concludes our agenda tonight, so I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Ms. Johnson.
Yes.
Mr. Geddes,
Yes.
Mr. Withers, yes. Mr. Larson,
Yes.
Mr. Storrs.
Yes.
Ms. Porto.
Yes.
Mr. Domenici,
Yes.
Mr. Hill.
Yes.
Ms. Sawyer.
Yes.
All right, thank you, everyone. Have a good night.